Hey guys, tonight we're heading into something darker and far stranger than the romanticized tales of knights and castles. Forget the polished stories of tournaments and chivalry. Real medieval history was written not just with swords, but with suffering. We're diving into the world of medieval medicine and the most terrible diseases of the Middle Ages: the plague, leprosy, smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, even dysentery. These weren't just illnesses, they shaped entire societies, rewrote cultures, and left scars, both on bodies and on history itself. So before we start, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the shadows of the past. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I love seeing how this little global community connects through forgotten stories. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe let a soft background hum fill the silence. Tonight's journey will take you into the flickering shadows of medieval Europe, where even a simple fever could mean your final prayer. The plague, queen of death. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was living its usual life. People traded, traveled, fought wars, and built houses and churches. No one suspected that very soon the continent would be struck by a disaster that would change the course of history. In 1347, Genoese ships arrived at the Italian port of Messina. They came from the shores of the Black Sea, from Crimea. On board were fabrics, spices, merchants, and sailors, but rats and fleas came with them. They became the carriers of an invisible enemy. The plague set foot on European soil. Almost immediately, strange deaths began in Messina. People fell ill suddenly, with high fevers and dark tumors appearing on their bodies. They died within days. The townspeople fled in fear, but the disease was already spreading. Ships from Messina sailed to other ports, and with them, the plague spread throughout Italy. Within a few months, the plague had spread to Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and Florence. Then the disease crossed the Alps and moved deeper into Europe. It seemed to follow the trade and pilgrimage routes, following caravans and ships. Year after year, it consumed new lands. By 1348, the plague was raging in France and Spain. By 1349, it had reached England. In 1350, it was already in Germany and Austria. Soon, the disease reached distant Scandinavia. The speed with which the plague spread across the continent astonished contemporaries. They knew neither its nature nor how to stop it. All they could do was watch as cities emptied, bells tolled over new graves, and streets turned into cemeteries. The chronicles of that time paint a picture of almost complete catastrophe. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that, in Florence, people were dying so quickly that their relatives were afraid to even touch the sick. Families fell apart, neighbors abandoned each other, and the streets were filled with weeping. In Paris, bodies were piled into huge pits and covered with earth layer by layer until the pit was filled to the brim. In London, there was no time to bury the dead, and priests simply blessed entire plots of land without reading prayers over each deceased person. According to historians' estimates, between 25 and 50 million people died in 4 years. Europe lost a third of its population. In some places, the mortality rate was even higher. Entire villages disappeared, leaving only empty houses and abandoned fields. People tried to find an explanation for what was happening. Some believed it was God's punishment. Others blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning the wells. Pogroms broke out in cities. Some people withdrew into seclusion, and spent their days in prayer, while others, on the contrary, indulged in drunkenness and debauchery, deciding that the end was inevitable anyway. Processions of flagellants passed through the streets, people who believed that by whipping their bodies they could appease the heavens. They walked from city to city, singing prayers and whipping themselves with lashes, leaving a bloody trail behind them. The plague changed the face of Europe. It destroyed millions, but at the same time, it liberated the land, disrupted the usual order of life, and shook society. After it, the world was never the same again. The plague not only claimed millions of lives, it also frightened people with how quickly and terrifyingly it manifested itself. Contemporaries wrote that the disease seemed to flare up inside a person. It all started with fever and weakness. It seemed as if the person had caught a cold or overheated in the sun, but after a few hours, the body began to be tormented by severe pain. Dense tumors appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. They were called buboes. They grew larger, sometimes reaching the size of a chicken egg, and caused excruciating pain. These buboes darkened, and the skin around them turned black and blue. Doctors at the time believed that this was blood rot breaking out. They tried to pierce and cauterize the swellings, but this rarely helped. More often than not, the patient died even faster after that. Internal bleeding was added to the fever and tumors. Blood appeared in phlegm from the nose, from the mouth. The person coughed, suffocated, and lost strength. Sometimes black spots appeared on the skin, similar to burns or traces of damage, hence the name Black Death. The most frightening thing was that the disease developed very quickly. Sometimes a person would go to bed in the evening completely healthy and wake up in the morning with a fever and buboes. Death could occur in 3 or 4 days, and sometimes even faster. The disease took various forms. There was bubonic plague, when the lymph nodes were affected. There was also pulmonary plague, which affected the lungs, causing the person to suffocate and cough up blood. This form was even more frightening because it was transmitted from person to person by airborne droplets. When the disease took a septic form, the infection instantly entered the bloodstream. The person died within a day, and sometimes within a few hours. Contemporaries said that the patient burned up before their eyes. There was no treatment. Doctors offered bloodletting and fumigation with herbs, and wore long beaks filled with lavender and rosemary, hoping to protect themselves from the bad air. But all this was useless. Witnesses of those times wrote that the very picture of the disease was terrifying. A person would become covered in black spots, swell up, their breathing would become wheezy, and their gaze would become empty. Many preferred not to approach the sick at all, leaving them to die alone. Thus the plague became not just a disease, but a symbol of fear. Even those who had not yet been infected lived in constant anticipation of its arrival. A city could wake up alive in the morning and turn into a dark death camp by evening. People who witnessed the plague quickly realized that the disease was frightening not only because of its symptoms, but also because it was contagious. It seemed as if death itself was roaming the streets, spreading from one body to another. Doctors, priests, and those who dared to care for the sick sought ways to protect themselves. In those days, bacteria and viruses were not yet known. It was believed that diseases were transmitted through contaminated air, the so-called miasma. That is why doctors came up with their unusual costume. It consisted of a long cloak made of thick fabric or leather, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. All this was supposed to cover the body from the outside world, but the most remarkable element was, of course, the helmet mask with a long beak. Dry herbs, rosemary, lavender, juniper, and mint were placed inside the beak. It was believed that aromatic plants purified the air and prevented the poison of the disease from entering the lungs. The eyes were covered with glass lenses so that nothing could get inside. The doctor held a long stick in his hands. With it, he could touch the patient without coming too close or indicate where to go. The stick was also used to disperse crowds and maintain distance. Today, this costume seems like a grim symbol of death, but back then, it was a symbol of hope. Plague doctors tried to help in any way they could, even though their options were pretty much limited. The treatments were simple and brutal. The most popular one was bloodletting. The doctor would cut open a vein and let some blood out, hoping that the disease would go away with it. Sometimes leeches were applied. Sometimes swollen buboes were cauterized with red-hot iron. Other methods included fumigation with smoke, inhalation of resin, and vinegar compresses. In some places, people were forced to drink decoctions of herbs and minerals, and sometimes even gold or pearls ground into powder. All of this was expensive and almost never helped. Some doctors recommended that their patients hold a live chicken in their hands and apply it to the tumors. It was believed that the bird would draw the disease out of the body. Sometimes the chicken died, and then it was replaced with a new one. Such scenes looked strange and eerie, but people believed that anything could help. There were also spiritual practices. Doctors advised praying, wearing amulets and relics on the body, and writing Bible quotes on doors. All this combined fear of the disease with hope for divine protection. Despite all efforts, the mortality rate remained terrifying. Masks and costumes did not save the doctors themselves. Many plague doctors died along with their patients, but the image of a man in a long cloak and a beak mask was etched into the memory of contemporaries and became a symbol of the 14th century. Thus, a new figure emerged in Europe, a doctor in a mask, both frightening and inspiring hope. For the sick, he was the last person they saw before death. For the living, he was a reminder that the disease was close and that it was impossible to hide from it. But doctors and their strange masks were only a small part of the picture. The plague had a much stronger impact on society itself. People who found themselves in its shadow changed before our eyes. Those who saw their loved ones fall ill and die in a matter of days lost hope. Many stopped caring about anyone but themselves. Sons abandoned their sick fathers. Wives left their husbands. Neighbors no longer visited each other's homes. Fear of contagion was stronger than family ties. Chronicles say that sometimes the dying were left alone, locked in their own rooms, because no one dared to approach them. There were others. People overcome with despair left the cities and tried to hide in the fields and mountains, believing that the disease would not reach them in the fresh air. Sometimes families and entire communities left their homes, abandoning their possessions just to escape the plague. Others, on the contrary, believed that salvation lay in prayer and repentance. They gathered in churches, prayed day and night, and carried crosses and relics, hoping to appease God. A movement of flagellants emerged, people who went from city to city, singing psalms and whipping themselves with lashes. Their processions made a strong impression. dozens of people with bloodied backs walked barefoot, fell to their knees, and got up again, believing that their suffering would purify the world. There were also those who chose a different path. They indulged in revelry and debauchery, organizing feasts and drinking parties. The chronicles describe groups of people who locked themselves in their homes and lived there as if in a perpetual celebration, believing that since death would come anyway, it was better to meet it with a cup of wine in their hands. The plague also exacerbated enmity between people. Jews were often blamed, believed to be the ones who poisoned the wells and brought the disease. Pogroms swept across Europe, killing thousands. It was a manifestation of fear, which sought to blame someone, and cruelty, which always lived alongside panic. In some places, the sick were treated with particular severity. If a person fell ill, their house could simply be sealed off and the doors boarded up so that they would die inside and not infect others. Sometimes food was thrown in, sometimes not even that. Townspeople passed by such houses, heard moans and cries, but no one dared to help. Thus the plague broke not only bodies, but also souls. It showed how fragile human connections were. At the same time, it revealed what people were capable of when left alone with their fears. For several years, the world of the 14th century turned into a world of loneliness, panic, and constant anticipation of the end. Even when the disease moved on, people did not feel relief. They knew it could return. When the first waves of terror began to subside and the survivors looked around, they realized that the world had changed, not only outwardly. The plague left a deep mark on their imagination and their faith. It entered legends, paintings, songs, and even prayers. Wherever the disease spread, the idea arose that death makes no distinctions. It took the poor, the king, the monk, and the merchant alike. This image of equality in the face of death became the basis for a motif that artists and poets of the time called the Dance of Death. It was painted on church walls and in manuscripts. A skeleton leading the living appeared alongside images of knights, shepherds, and bishops. The Dance of Death reminded everyone that no one can escape the end, and that everything that seems important in life, wealth, power, honor, dissolves in an instant. In painting, scenes appeared where death was depicted not as an enemy, but as a companion to man. In sculpture, gloomy realism intensified. Tombstones began to be carved not only with beautiful figures of the deceased, but also with their bodies in a state of decay. Such images were called transi. This was a direct reminder of the transience of life, of the fact that after the plague, death could no longer be seen as a rare exception. It became part of everyday life. In literature, the theme of the plague was loud and frightening. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote his Decameron, in which 10 young people flee Florence and pass the time in a country villa, telling each other stories. This book became not only a collection of short stories, but also a testimony to how people sought solace in words and fiction when death reigned around them. The songs and legends of that time echo with the motif of the end of the world. Many believed that the plague was a harbinger of the Last Judgment. It seemed that the world was truly coming to an end, and even when the disaster subsided somewhat, people continued to feel its presence for a long time. The plague even changed architecture. Churches and chapels began to be built more often, many of them dedicated to the patron saints of disease, Saint Rauch and Saint Sebastian. Their images filled the altars. Their names were invoked in prayers. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, became a symbol of those struck by the plague. Terrible images became fixed in the popular imagination. People told stories about ghosts and sinister figures that supposedly foreshadowed the arrival of the disease. Death became not an abstract concept, but an almost living being that could be encountered at night on a deserted street or seen in a dream. This is how the plague entered everyday consciousness. It changed ideas about life and death, about the value of time, about what it means to be human. People began to look at fate differently. They understood that in one day you could lose everything, and that life always hangs by a thread. When Europe recovered from the Black Death, it was already different. Old foundations were shaken, religious faith took on new shades of fear, and art became darker and deeper. The plague was not just a disease, it became part of the culture and one of the symbols of an entire era. When the plague finally subsided and its waves receded, Europe was left in ruins. Those who survived the disaster looked around and realized that their world no longer existed. Too many had perished. In some places, nearly half the population had died. Villages were deserted, fields overgrown with weeds. Cities became quieter because they no longer had enough craftsmen, merchants, and artisans. The shortage of labor was felt everywhere. The land lay fallow, houses stood empty, shops were closed. But where the old was crumbling, something new was emerging. Those who survived gained an unexpected advantage. Labor became scarce, and peasants began to demand more rights and better pay for their work. The power of the feudal lords was shaken, and the old order began to crumble. The plague was one of the catalysts for the changes that would later lead Europe to the Renaissance and new ideas. It also changed religious life. For many, faith grew stronger, but skepticism also increased. People saw that prayers did not stop the plague and asked themselves, why did God allow this to happen? Who is to blame? The answers varied, but doubt was sown, and it would grow in the centuries to come. Society became gloomier. People thought about death more often and remembered their mortality more often. But at the same time, many felt that they had to live for the moment because tomorrow might never come. This gave rise to a thirst for pleasure, a desire for celebration, and a desire to enjoy the moment. The shadow of the plague remained in the memory of an entire generation. Children who saw empty streets and mass graves grew up in a world where death no longer seemed rare. For them, it was a familiar part of life. And this generation brought with it a new view of the world, less naive and more sober. The Black Death became a dividing line in European history, separating before and after. It took millions of lives, but it also paved the way for change. The continent that recovered from it was no longer the same. It was a different world, where the value of human life was understood differently, where traditions were shaken, and new ideas began to emerge from the darkness. Thus, a terrible disease carried on the paws of rats and in the bites of fleas became an event that changed the course of history. It showed how fragile human order is and how quickly everything familiar can disappear. And although many centuries have passed, the memory of the Black Death remains. It lives on in books, paintings, legends, and in people's minds as a reminder that no century is free from trials. Leprosy was a disease of a completely different nature than the plague. It did not strike like a sudden storm, kill in 3 days, or turn cities into graveyards in a single summer. It moved slowly, like a shadow, that imperceptibly falls on a person's life and stays with them forever. The first signs were almost imperceptible. First, small spots appeared on the skin. They could be pale or reddish and seemed like a simple rash or sunburn. Sometimes a person felt a slight numbness, tingling, or mild itching. No one guessed that this was the beginning of a long journey from which there was no turning back. Over time, the spots grew larger. The skin on them became rough and lost sensitivity. If a person burned or cut themselves in these areas, they felt no pain. Gradually, the fingers and toes became numb. The face lost its mobility, and the features became frozen. People said that the faces of lepers turned into masks. The disease destroyed the body slowly year after year. A person's eyebrows and eyelashes fell out, and their nose and ears became deformed. Ulcers appeared on the skin that did not heal. They emitted an odor which further alienated the sick from society. Sometimes the sores affected the hands and feet, and the fingers gradually shortened or disappeared altogether. The worst thing was that leprosy almost never killed quickly. It turned life into a prolonged death. A person could live with this disease for 10, 20, and sometimes more years, but all this time they slowly lost their bodies and their place in the world. The symptoms seemed both physical and frighteningly symbolic. The face of a leper changed so much that they became unrecognizable. Their features became blurred, their gaze became empty, and their movements became awkward. In the medieval mind, such changes seemed to be a sign of a curse, an imprint of sin. But the hardest thing for patients was not only the physical pain. Gradually, a person became a stranger. They were feared and shunned. Even relatives could stop coming close, fearing infection. And although the disease was not as easily transmitted as the plague, fear was stronger than knowledge. Leprosy seemed to slowly rob a person, not only of their health, but also of their very place in society. The sick person became a living dead person who still walked the streets, but was already deprived of their usual place among the living. As the disease became more severe, society reacted harshly. A person who showed signs of leprosy gradually ceased to be part of normal life. They were not killed or executed, but separated from everyone else as if by an invisible wall. In some parts of Europe, there were special rituals that resembled funerals. If someone was found to have leprosy, a priest could perform a service over them, almost the same as for the dead. Prayers were read over the person as if they had already left this world. After that, they were officially considered dead to society, even though their bodies continued to walk and breathe. Special places were created for such people, leprosariums. These were small settlements or houses on the outskirts of cities, sometimes outside the city walls, where only lepers lived. They were settled together to isolate them from the rest of the population. Life in such places was hard and poor. The disease destroyed their bodies, and poverty and hunger destroyed what strength they had left. Lepers were forbidden to appear freely among people. If they needed to walk along the road or enter the city, they had to warn people about themselves. They often carried special bells or wooden rattles so that people could hear from afar that a sick person was approaching. Sometimes they were required to wear special clothing, coarse, made of a single color fabric, so that everyone could recognize them at first glance. People tried to avoid meeting them. Even alms were given from a distance. Sometimes food was placed on the ground or thrown so as not to touch it. At the entrances to leprosariums, you could see baskets in which townspeople placed bread or clothes without getting too close. The life of lepers flowed slowly, almost in silence. They communicated only with each other, shared a beggarly existence, cared for their wounded bodies, and waited for the end, which could come in years. They did not participate in the life of the city, did not see holidays and markets, did not hear joy. They lived nearby, but as if in another world, where everything was subject to disease. This is how a special fate was born. A person remained in this world, but was no longer considered truly alive. He ceased to be part of his family, ceased to be part of society. Leprosy transformed not only the body, but also life itself into a slow disappearance. For people in the Middle Ages, leprosy was not just a physical illness. It seemed to be a sign, a mark placed by God Himself. When a person was covered with spots and sores, society saw this not as a medical mystery, but as a manifestation of the higher will. Leprosy was considered a punishment for sins. Sometimes it was said that the sick person was personally guilty, sometimes that they were suffering for the sins of the whole people. Priests and preachers reminded people that the disease purified the soul through suffering, and therefore lepers should humbly bear their cross. Leprosy was mentioned more than once in biblical texts, which gave the disease special significance. People believed that the touch of God could both inflict it and heal it. Old Testament stories about Moses or King Uzziah were recounted in sermons, and parishioners saw modern patients as a continuation of these ancient examples. Lepers were not killed because they were seen as a living reminder of sin and punishment. Their suffering became a kind of sermon. Everyone who saw their disfigured faces and bodies was reminded of their own sinfulness, and that punishment could befall anyone. At the same time, some believed that leprosy made a person special before God. Their suffering was equated with martyrdom. They already lived as if outside the world, and their pain was considered almost a holy trial. Some monks even sought closeness to lepers, caring for them, considering it a service and a feat. But in everyday life, attitudes remained ambivalent. Some rejected the sick, others gave them alms, and still others saw them as chosen sufferers. Leprosy was both a curse and a reminder of faith, a repulsive horror, and a quiet symbol of humility. Thus, the disease became something more than just a physical ailment. It became part of the religious experience, part of a worldview where every ulcer had meaning, every lost body part had an explanation, and every drop of pain had its price. When faith explained illness as punishment or a test, art reinforced this image. Artists, sculptors, and scribes of the Middle Ages could not ignore something that so greatly frightened and fascinated people. And so leprosy found its reflection in books, miniatures, on church walls, and in legends. Manuscripts contain images of people with disfigured faces and hands. They were depicted in long robes, with bells or rattles in their hands, to show that they were outcasts, living nearby but already outside society. Such images served as a reminder of sin and how quickly beauty and strength can turn into ugliness and weakness. In church frescoes, lepers were depicted alongside saints. Most often, these were scenes of mercy, a saint touching a sick person, feeding them, or washing their sores. Such images taught parishioners compassion, showing that helping others is more important than fear. But behind these scenes, there was always the idea that not everyone is capable of such a feat, and therefore saints are above ordinary people. In folk tales, lepers became characters in parables and legends. Sometimes they appeared as wanderers who could come to you at night and ask for a piece of bread. and then reveal that they were messengers of God. Sometimes they were figures of terror, a reminder of sinful life and its consequences. Legends about miraculous healings occupied a special place. In them, lepers became a symbol of divine mercy. In prayers to saints, especially to Saint Lazarus, their images appeared again and again. After all, Lazarus was considered the patron saint of all those rejected by society, and it was to him that many leprosariums were dedicated. And yet, most often, lepers in art were not heroes, but symbols of suffering, punishment, and inevitability. Their faces on icons and miniatures reminded every viewer that no one is immune to misfortune. This is how the disease entered culture. It became part of religious imagery, part of artistic language, part of society's memory. Leprosy became an eternal sign that the body is fragile and life can change at any moment. Over time, people stopped seeing lepers as simply sick people. Their appearance was perceived as a sign that they were already halfway out of the world of the living. Their disfigured faces, immobile features, blotchy skin, and numb limbs made them look like living corpses, like people who should have been buried long ago, but still walked among the living. This association was also reflected in words, chronicles, sermons, songs. Many called lepers the living dead. They still breathed and moved, but society regarded them as dead. And this death, while still alive, was not only in the eyes of others, but also in the fate of the sick person himself. He was buried with a ceremony while still alive, sent to a leper colony, and his name was removed from the city registers. Everything that made him part of the community disappeared. The image of the living dead was particularly frightening. It embodied the most ancient human fear, to be close to someone who already belongs to another world. The leper was a reminder of the transience of the body, of the fact that the same thing could happen to any healthy person. That is why people avoided encounters, turned their faces away, and crossed to the other side of the road. But at the same time, there was a strange power in this image. The leper, rejected by society, became an extremely symbolic figure. He was both cursed and marked by God. He lived as if between worlds, no longer here, but not yet there. And so his existence was both disturbing and fascinating, forcing people to see him as more than just a sick person. Thus, leprosy created a whole myth around itself. The disease ceased to be just a disease. It became a metaphor. The leper was a symbol of sin, punishment, suffering, but also a reminder of fortitude, of the slow death that a person endures for years, witnessing their own slow demise. For the medieval world, it was an image that was impossible to forget. The plague came and went, leaving empty cities and mass graves. But leprosy remained always. It did not kill quickly, but turned life into a shadow of itself. And that is why the people it affected were called the living dead. Smallpox, medieval scar, designer, leprosy slowly turned people into living dead step by step. But there was another disease that acted faster and left its own special marks. It was smallpox. It was not always feared as much as the plague or leprosy, but when it struck, it ravaged entire cities. It could not be confused with anything else. It began suddenly. High fever, body aches, weakness, nausea. The person seemed to fall into a fever, and for several days they were tormented by a high fever. And then the most recognizable symptom appeared, a rash. At first, small red spots. Then they turned into blisters filled with fluid. The face was completely covered with them. then the hands, the body. It seemed that the patient's skin was swelling and changing, and this sight was no less terrifying than the plague itself. The rash turned into abscesses, which burst and left deep scars. If a person survived, their skin retained these marks forever. Their face became covered with scars, as if it had been burned by fire or hundreds of small wounds. These scars made the sick recognizable for the rest of their lives. They could not be hidden. They could not be forgotten. In medieval society, it was almost a stigma, even if a person survived the disease and returned to life. Their face always reminded them of what they had gone through. The mortality rate from smallpox was high. Many of those who fell ill died within a few weeks. The disease was especially terrible for children. Entire generations died before they had a chance to grow up. But even adults rarely survived it easily. Those who did survive often lost their sight because the rash affected their eyes. Loss of vision and a disfigured face made life after the disease no less difficult than the disease itself. And yet, smallpox accompanied people for centuries. It came again and again, and each new wave left behind many dead and even more disfigured. Where the plague destroyed quickly and suddenly, smallpox left a lasting memory on the faces of those who survived. It turned faces into living chronicles of the disease which bore its marks for decades. Thus, this disease became not only a threat to life, but also a threat to the memory of oneself. Every scar on the face was a mark, a sign that a person had encountered smallpox and somehow remained alive. Smallpox was not just a single disease, but a constant companion of entire generations. It did not disappear, but returned again and again. Waves of epidemics swept across continents, leaving behind death, disability, and scarred faces. Long before Europe learned about it in all its fullness, the disease already existed in Asia. Chinese chronicles mention smallpox as a disaster that came to cities and took hundreds of lives. Smallpox was also known in India, where it was associated with angry deities. People prayed and made sacrifices in an attempt to appease the invisible force that maimed and killed. When smallpox spread deeper into Europe, it began to be seen as inevitable. No city was completely safe. The disease could start in one house and spread throughout an entire neighborhood in a matter of weeks. The mortality rate was so high that people stopped counting the dead. Some chronicles describe how entire monasteries were struck down. The monks fell ill one after another, and the monastery, which had recently been full of singing, turned into a dark place where only funeral bells rang. Smallpox was especially common among children. Families could lose several children at once, and this was considered almost normal. Even those who survived rarely came out of this disease without consequences. Faces covered with deep scars became a common sight on the streets. People recognized each other by these marks, as if they were an involuntary sign of what they had been through. The disease spared no one. The chronicles mention cases when entire dynasties lost their heirs and kings buried their children and brothers. Smallpox was equally merciless to the poor and the noble. It could come to a castle as easily as to a hut. Its constant return made it almost familiar. People knew that the epidemic would go away, but it would return again. That was the horror of it. The plague could sweep through and disappear for decades. Leprosy slowly destroyed only those it touched, but smallpox was always there, like a shadow waiting for the right moment. Each new generation knew it not from hearsay, but from experience. It became part of life itself. Smallpox became something impossible to forget because its traces remained not only in memory, but also on people's bodies. People who encountered smallpox could not remain indifferent. The disease was frightening because of its inevitability, and medieval doctors sought ways to alleviate the suffering of patients in any way they could. But in a world where medicine knew neither microbes nor vaccines, these attempts were more like desperate gestures than real help. The usual first step was bloodletting. It was believed that excess blood was poisoned by the disease and needed to be released so that the body could be cleansed. The patient's veins were opened, leeches were applied, sometimes several times in a row. More often than not, the patient only grew weaker and the disease took him faster. Another method was the use of herbs. The patient was fumigated with smoke, and bundles of rosemary, wormwood, and juniper were brought to his face. Inhaling the fragrant smoke was supposed to cleanse the breath and expel the bad air that was considered to be the cause of the disease. Decoctions of roots and leaves, often bitter and heavy on the stomach, were given internally. Some healers advised applying vinegar or wine compresses to skin ulcers. There were even recipes with crushed precious stones, pearls, sapphires, emeralds. It was believed that rare minerals possessed a secret power and could stop the disease, but such remedies were only available to the rich, and most often they did not work. Special attention was paid to food. Patients were offered diets, light soups, boiled vegetables, bread with bran. Sometimes, on the contrary, meat and wine were recommended to strengthen the body. There was no consensus, and each doctor followed his own experience or tradition. In some places, rituals were used. Prayers were read over the sick. They were sprinkled with holy water, and relics were placed on their bodies. People believed that illness could be expelled through divine intervention. Often, children afflicted with smallpox were brought to temples, and prayers were said for a miracle. There were also strange methods that were more reminiscent of magic. A doctor might advise wearing an amulet made of special herbs or metals on the chest. Sometimes words of prayer written on parchment were placed in such amulets. They were worn as protection, believing that they would ward off the disease or alleviate its course. But no matter what method was used, most patients still died. Smallpox did not yield to any tricks. It followed its own path, leaving only survivors with scars and memories of suffering. A doctor could sit at a patient's bedside, fumigate them with smoke, apply bandages, read prayers, but the outcome remained the same. The disease took lives indiscriminately, and yet these attempts were significant. They showed that people did not give up, even in the face of such a threat. Medieval doctors sought hope where there was almost none. Their efforts did not save lives, but they gave patients the feeling that someone was still trying to help, even if their powers were insignificant. Even if a person survived smallpox, the disease never left them completely. It left marks that were visible to everyone, always. These marks became not just traces of the disease, but part of a person's destiny, part of their image, and even their place in society. The scars on their faces were deep, noticeable, sometimes distorting their features so much that it was difficult to recognize them. Such people always stood out in a crowd. Their faces told a story, even if they themselves remained silent. Society had mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, a disfigured face was a sign of suffering. People with such scars could be shunned, especially if they looked frightening. For many, it was a reminder of death, too harsh and unpleasant. In marriage, friendship, and communication, such marks could become a barrier. It was as if the person always carried with them evidence of their vulnerability. But on the other hand, these marks were also a sign of strength. Surviving smallpox was considered almost a miracle. When the disease took thousands of lives, the very fact that someone had survived commanded respect and fear. The scars became a mark of survival, a special sign that this person had already encountered smallpox and overcome it. In popular belief, such faces were sometimes even endowed with mystical meaning. People said, since he survived what killed many, he must have special protection or a blessing. Songs and legends mentioned heroes with disfigured faces, and they were perceived not only as cripples, but also as marked by fate. Smallpox also changed ideas about beauty. Women who survived the disease often lost the opportunity to marry because their faces were considered ruined. Men with scars could have difficulty communicating, but sometimes their marks were perceived as evidence of courage and fortitude. In medieval art, smallpox was rarely depicted directly, but its shadow was present. Chronicles mentioned faces covered with pits, and legends told of heroes whom fate had changed. People understood that this was part of life, part of memory that could not be erased. Thus, smallpox not only killed, but also created a new image of a person who survived but always carried the memory of the disease with them. Their face became a living document that could not be hidden, and this document was read by everyone who met their gaze. Thus, smallpox became a cultural symbol. It left behind not only pain and death, but also a special language of scars through which the history of an entire generation could be read. But neither scars nor disfigured faces were the most frightening thing for people in the Middle Ages. They were much more disturbed by the very idea that the disease was a sign from above. And so, alongside treatment, fumigation, and bloodletting, there was always another, deeper form of struggle: prayer. Faith explained smallpox in the same way it explained other disasters. The disease was considered a punishment sent by God for people's sins. When a new outbreak appeared, cities were filled with processions. People carried crosses, lit candles, and sang psalms, hoping that humility and repentance would ward off the plague. Special prayers were held in churches dedicated to healing the sick and protecting children who most often died from this disease. Saints who were considered intercessors held a special place in prayers. In Italy and France, these included Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch. Their images appeared on altars, and their names were spoken in homes when an epidemic broke out in the city. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, symbolized the suffering body, and people believed that he understood their pain. Saint Roch was considered a protector against contagion, and people turned to him when it seemed that there was no other help. Folk tales told stories of miraculous healings. They spoke of children who miraculously recovered after touching a shrine or spending a night at the altar. People believed that saints could intervene in the course of an illness and change fate. These stories kept hope alive and gave strength to those who were still alive. But along with prayers, there was also fear. The fear was so strong that sometimes it became almost a force in itself. People were afraid to get close to the sick, afraid to look at their faces. Sometimes a neighbor would leave their home just because they found out that someone nearby had smallpox. Fear and faith went hand in hand. Some locked themselves in their homes and did not go outside for weeks, while others went to church and prayed for a miracle. Some made vows to give up their wealth, go on a pilgrimage, or give everything they had left to the church. All this was not only an attempt to protect themselves, but also a way to find meaning in a disease that seemed senseless and merciless. And although smallpox continued to return again and again, faith helped people survive it. They found comfort in prayers, hope in legends, and an explanation for why death sometimes receded in miracles. The disease took millions of lives, but the memory of miraculous recoveries lived longer than the memory of defeat. So alongside the horror, there was also the expectation of a miracle. And for many, this expectation was the only force that helped them survive another night of illness. Ergotism, the bread nightmare. Smallpox left behind bodies covered in scars and generations that carried memories of pain and fear. But in the Middle Ages, there were other kinds of diseases, ones that appeared unexpectedly, as if from the ground itself. People may have feared the plague or leprosy, but they were even more terrified by the idea that disease could be hidden in their food, in what was considered the basis of life. Bread, the main staple on the table, sometimes became a source of suffering. Ergotism was the name given to the disease caused by ergot, a tiny fungus that affects rye. It was almost impossible to see with the naked eye. The grain looked almost normal, but inside it was already poisoned. When bread was baked from such rye, it became poisonous, and people ate it, suspecting nothing. They sat down at the table, thanked God for the food, and shared a loaf of bread with their family, and with it, they lead in a disease that could maim and kill. The symptoms varied. Sometimes there were violent convulsions, as if the body were being squeezed by an iron hand. People fell to the ground, writhing, their arms and legs bent into unnatural positions. Sometimes there was excruciating pain in the stomach and an unbearable burning sensation in the limbs. The skin turned black and fingers died off. People called it Anton's fire because it felt as if a person was being burned from within. There were other manifestations as well. People began to see strange images, hear voices that weren't there, feel touches that no one was making. These were hallucinations caused by ergot poison. The sick screamed, cried, sometimes laughed for no reason, sometimes ran away, as if pursued by an invisible shadow. To their neighbors, it looked like possession. They believed that people had fallen under the power of the devil or witches. Villages began to whisper that an evil force had entered the bread, and indeed, what was happening to the sick did not resemble ordinary illnesses. It was like madness, like a nightmare coming to life in broad daylight. Ergotism affected not just one person, but entire communities. When the harvest was spoiled by ergot, dozens and hundreds fell ill. Entire villages became places of suffering, screams, moans, the smell of rot from blackened limbs. Doctors did not understand the cause, and therefore explained everything as witchcraft, punishment, or the intervention of the devil. And the most frightening thing was that no one could be sure of their safety. Today, bread seems like a blessing. Tomorrow, it becomes a curse. An ordinary loaf eaten at lunch could turn into weeks of torment or a slow death. Thus, rye, which fed the peoples of Europe, became a source of horror, and the disease that came with it reminded people that even the most familiar food could hide death. When ergotism struck entire villages, Its manifestations seemed so strange that people could not believe it was just a disease. It seemed as if the devil himself had descended to earth and was playing with human bodies and souls. Chronicles describe how entire groups of people began to behave as if possessed by an unknown force. They screamed, waved their arms, fell to the ground, then got up and moved again in an unnatural rhythm. Sometimes these attacks turned into actual dances that lasted for hours or even days. Contemporaries called this the Dance of St. Vitus. Crowds of sick people took to the streets, shaking, jumping, and spinning as if in a mad dance. It was impossible to stop them. Even if they were held by their arms and legs, their bodies continued to writhe. People who witnessed this believed that the spirit of a saint had descended upon the unfortunate, or, conversely, that they had been possessed by demons. The dancing was accompanied by visions. The sick reported seeing strange images, fire engulfing their bodies, devils chasing them, or shining angels calling them. Sometimes several people said they saw the same thing, which further strengthened the belief that what was happening was supernatural. In the same villages where ergot affected Rye, rumors about witches often spread. People were convinced that illness and frenzied dancing were caused by witchcraft. Women and men suspected of communicating with the devil could be accused of mixing poison into bread or putting a curse on the harvest. These accusations often ended in trials and executions. Thus, the disease, already painful, brought with it a new fear, the fear of being accused of witchcraft. Those who fell ill suffered from pain and hallucinations, while their neighbors lived in anticipation of a trial where any suspicion could result in a death sentence. It was especially tragic that entire communities were affected when the rye harvest in the region was infected with ergot. It was not individual families that suffered, but dozens and hundreds of people. The disease became a collective nightmare. For weeks, the villages were filled with screams and moans. The streets were filled with strange dances, and the churches were filled with prayers and incantations intended to drive out evil. People did not know that all this was the work of a small fungus in the ears of grain. For them, it was a manifestation of the supernatural. And so, ergotism went down in history not only as a disease, but also as a mystical phenomenon. It was associated with the devil, witches, divine punishment, and a mysterious force that could not be explained by reason. Thus, bread, which was supposed to be a symbol of life, became a gateway to a world of nightmares. And there was something particularly frightening about this. Every piece eaten at dinner could be the beginning of visions, dancing, and pain that destroyed not only the body, but reality itself. Ergotism was not limited to stories and rumors. Chronicles contain references to real events when entire communities fell victim to this strange disease. In the 11th century, France experienced what would later be called the Great Fire. Dozens of villages were affected. People fell in the streets, their bodies covered with black spots, their arms and legs turning black and dying. The chronicles said that it was Saint Anthony's fire, and it claimed hundreds of lives. At that time, the first brotherhoods dedicated to Saint Anthony appeared, caring for the sick. They built shelters and monasteries where they tried to ease the suffering, but there was still no real cure. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the disease flared up again and again. In some places, it led to terrible suffering, with people losing limbs and dying of gangrene. In others, it led to mass psychosis, when entire groups of peasants and townspeople fell into madness. Contemporaries wrote about dancing cities where hundreds of people infected with ergot took to the streets and could not stop. They danced until they fell exhausted. A particularly well-known case occurred in Strasbourg in the early 16th century. Hundreds of people were seized by Saint Vitus' dance. They danced for weeks, some dying of exhaustion, others dropping dead right in the squares. Contemporaries were convinced that it was a curse or witchcraft. But today, historians believe that some of these cases may have been linked to mass ergot poisoning. Ergotism was insidious in that it affected not only the poor. Poisoned bread found its way onto the tables of the rich and noble. No one was completely safe. Even monasteries, where rye bread was the main food, suffered from this disease. In the manuscripts of monks, you can find records of how brothers fell ill, saw strange visions, and died painful deaths. But it was the peasants who suffered the most. The rye harvest was the basis of their livelihood. If the grain was affected by ergot, there was no choice. The bread had to be eaten because there was no other food. And then entire villages turned into places of pain and horror. Each such outbreak left behind not only corpses, but also legends. People told stories of how a neighbor turned into a witch, how a man heard the devil's voices, how children danced until they dropped dead. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, became part of folklore, and reinforced the belief that the disease was the work of evil forces. Thus, real epidemics became intertwined with myths, and that is why ergotism became one of the most mysterious and terrifying diseases of the Middle Ages. It destroyed bodies, broke minds, and left behind memories in which it was impossible to separate truth from legend. When villages and towns were confronted with ergotism, its manifestations seemed too strange to be explained solely by physical infirmity. People writhed in pain, their skin darkened, their fingers died, and at the same time they screamed that they saw fire or shadows, that they heard voices, that the devil was standing nearby. For neighbors, this was proof. The disease did not come on its own, but through an evil force. And so, it is not surprising that ergotism became closely associated with witch hunts. Each new case of mass hallucinations and dancing raised questions. Who brought this disaster? Why did an entire village suddenly go mad? The answer was found quickly. People said it was witchcraft. Somewhere in the neighborhood, there was a witch who had cursed the bread and sent the plague. Interrogations, rumors, and accusations began. Women who lived alone, knew herbs, or were simply considered strange were the first suspects. They could be accused of mixing something into the grain, of infecting the harvest with their gaze, of bringing the devil to the village. The chronicles preserve stories where outbreaks of Saint Anthony's fire or Saint Vitus' dance were followed by witch trials. Under torture, the accused confessed to things they had not done. They told of nighttime meetings with demons, of powders and ointments with which they allegedly poisoned bread. For judges and ordinary people, this was confirmation that the disease was not natural, but demonic in origin. These ideas became particularly intertwined in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, when witch hunts reached their peak. Mass psychosis caused by ergot drove people to search for the guilty, and the guilty were found among the weak, the poor, those who could not defend themselves. Thus, ergotism became not only a disease, but also fuel for fear. It turned ordinary crop failures and outbreaks of disease into a reason for burning people at the stake. Where peasants ate contaminated bread and died of hallucinations and gangrene. Their neighbors saw the work of witches and the devil. Thus, a small fungus in rye ears became the cause not only of suffering, but also of human cruelty. It gave rise to fear that sought an outlet, and that outlet was found in accusations, pogroms, and executions. And so, ergotism went down in history not only as a disease, but also as one of the invisible driving forces behind the witch hunts, like a shadow hanging over European villages and towns, turning ordinary bread into a symbol of damnation and devilish power. Fear and accusations were only one side of the story, but alongside them there was another, quieter and more humane reflection of the disease. People not only sought to blame someone, but also tried to help those who had been struck by this misfortune. Ergotism was given a special name among the people, Saint Anthony's fire. It was called this because patients spoke of a burning sensation as if their bodies were engulfed in flames. Their hands and feet burned from within, their skin turned black, and their limbs died off. The fire, which no one could see, consumed their bodies slowly and painfully. The name of this Saint Anthony the Great was associated with this image. He was considered the patron saint of those suffering from fire and pain. In the 11th century, brotherhoods dedicated to Saint Anthony arose in France. These people collected donations, built shelters, and cared for the sick. In their monasteries, the sick found at least some relief. Here they were given food, their bandages were changed, and people prayed beside them. Often, the only comfort was care, simple human care, which was lacking in ordinary villages where the sick were shunned. Sometimes the brotherhoods used a special ointment made from pork fat and herbs to lubricate the ulcers. It was called Saint Anthony's ointment. Belief in its power was combined with practical effect. The ointment softened the skin a little and relieved the pain. People perceived this as a miracle, as a sign of the saint's presence nearby. The monasteries of Saint Anthony became places where the sick from different regions flocked. Here they were met not as cursed, but as suffering people in need of mercy. And although there were few healings, the very existence of these brotherhoods showed that even in the face of horror, people are capable of compassion. Over time, St. Anthony's fire became not only a disease, but also an image in culture. It was depicted on icons next to the figure of Saint Anthony. Songs and legends told of miracles of healing attributed to his intercession. Thus, the disease, which was associated with the devil and witches, simultaneously gave rise to a movement of mercy, where bonfires burned and people were accused and executed. Candles burned in monasteries, where bread and water were brought to the sick, and prayers were said for them. Ergotism served as a reminder that human life is fragile and vulnerable, but it also showed that compassion can always exist alongside horror. And the Middle Ages lived with this contradiction for centuries, between fear of darkness and faith in the light of the saints. Tuberculosis, the slow killer. Some diseases in the Middle Ages acted rapidly. The plague took lives in a matter of days. Ergotism turned bread into a curse. Smallpox left behind scars and death. But there was another scourge that did not act so abruptly. It seemed to wait for life to smolder slowly, so that a person would die, not immediately, but gradually, day after day, year after year. This disease was called consumption, and later tuberculosis. It did not strike suddenly, like a storm, but crept quietly, like fog. First, a slight cough appeared. It could last for weeks, and people did not pay much attention to it. Then the cough became stronger, the voice became hoarse, and breathing became difficult. People lost weight, lost strength, became pale, with thin facial features and deep-set eyes. It seemed as if life itself was slowly leaving them, and their bodies were becoming more and more transparent, like shadows. On hot days, patients felt chills, and on cold days, they broke out in a sweat. Nights were spent in agonizing coughing fits. Sometimes the cough was accompanied by blood. Scarlet spots on a white handkerchief became a terrible omen. At such moments, the sick understood that the disease had already taken root deeply, and there was no turning back. Consumption could last for months, or it could stretch on for years. A person became weaker and weaker, but did not die immediately. He lived on the border between life and death, and this border stretched out in time. Many patients continued to walk, work, and pray, but every day they gave another piece of their breath to the disease. In the Middle Ages, tuberculosis was especially frightening because it seemed to slowly erase a person from society. Today, they could sit at the table with their family, and tomorrow they could not get out of bed. Its presence was a reminder that death could be a long companion, not a sudden blow. This disease affected everyone, poor and rich, peasants and nobles, but most often its victims were those who lived in cramped houses, in dampness and hunger. People understood that consumption was a disease of the poor, but even royal palaces were not completely protected. Tuberculosis was not as visible a catastrophe as the plague or smallpox. It did not turn cities into deserts in a month, but that was precisely why it was so terrifying. It was always there, like a shadow, like a slow poison that could not be stopped. Thus, in the Middle Ages, there was a special kind of death, not sudden and violent, but long, quiet, with a prolonged cough and a pale face, passing away step by step. Consumption manifested itself slowly but inevitably. At first, a person felt tired, which could easily be attributed to hard work or the cold. Their strength faded away unnoticed. They would sit in silence for long periods of time, rest more often than before, and say that they simply had a weak heart or bad air in their chest. But gradually, weakness became a constant companion. The person lost weight. Their face became sharp, with prominent cheekbones and deep shadows under their eyes. Their cheeks sometimes burned with a feverish blush that deceived those around them. It seemed that there was still life and health in them, but this blush was a harbinger of the end. The cough grew worse with each passing month. During the day, it interrupted conversations. At night, it kept both the patient and his loved ones awake. Each coughing fit was followed by pain and weakness in his chest. Sometimes there were traces of blood on his palms, small but frightening stains that could not be hidden. At night, the disease was especially painful. Patients often woke up in a sweat, their sheets damp with heat and fever. They tossed and turned, seeking coolness, but relief did not come. Their bodies seemed to be burning from within, and at the same time, their chests felt increasingly constricted. Rumors of such a cough quickly spread among the neighbors. People knew that there was a consumptive nearby. This word sounded almost like a sentence. Families tried to hide the disease, but this was rarely successful for long. If a person lost weight, coughed, and had blood stains on their hands or clothes, everything became obvious. The lives of such families changed. The sick person was surrounded by care, but also by fear. Relatives tried to ease his suffering. They brought pillows, warm blankets, herbal decoctions, But at the same time, deep down, they understood that the disease would not recede. Each new coughing fit reminded them that the end was near. For the sick person himself, time turned into a long road where with each step it became harder to breathe. He saw his hands getting thinner, the skin on his face tightening, his eyes dimming. He understood that he was dying, but dying slowly, witnessing his own demise. Thus, tuberculosis created a special atmosphere, not one of sudden horror like the plague, but one of prolonged anticipation. The disease became intertwined with the family's life, becoming a part of it, like the quiet music of death that played for months and years, until the last cough finally cut it off. When the disease lasted for months and resisted all efforts to cure it, people tried to find an explanation for it. Medieval doctors and ordinary people saw consumption not simply as physical weakness, but as something more, a special condition that slowly and inevitably took away life. Some believed that the cause was hidden in the air itself, in cramped, damp houses where windows were rarely opened and where smoke from the hearth filled the air. The air seemed heavy and harmful. Doctors wrote that consumption developed where there was no fresh wind or sun. Therefore, sometimes patients were sent out of the city, to the fields, to the forests, to monasteries where the air was cleaner. There they were supposed to breathe freely and fill their lungs with the healthy power of nature. Others explained the disease as an imbalance of fluids in the body. It was believed that there were 4 main fluids in the human body, and if one of them became excessive, illness would result. Doctors said that consumptives had too much black bile or smoldering juice, which destroyed the lungs. Therefore, they tried to treat the disease with bloodletting. They released some of the blood, hoping to restore balance. Bloodletting was the most common method, but it was far from the only one. Patients were prescribed special diets. Some doctors recommended light foods, vegetables, milk, bread with bran. Others, on the contrary, believed that patients needed more strength and prescribed meat, broths, and fortified wine. Often, such advice contradicted each other, and each family decided for themselves whom to believe. Herbs were widely used. Consumptives were given decoctions of licorice root, coltsfoot, and plantain to drink. The leaves were dried and brewed as tea, and the smoke from some plants was even inhaled in the hope of clearing the chest. Doctors and healers recommended smoking resin or inhaling the vapors of hot milk with honey. All this was supposed to calm the cough and ease breathing. Sometimes more unusual methods were used. For example, it was considered beneficial to drink milk from donkeys or goats. Some believed that breathing fresh air in caves or by the sea could slow down the disease. In rare cases, even the ashes of burnt animal bones mixed with wine were used. But no matter how hard the doctors tried, the disease remained stronger. All remedies only alleviated the suffering for a short time. No bloodletting, no decoctions could stop the slow destruction of the lungs. And yet, despite the powerlessness of medicine, attempts to treat consumption continued, because every family, every patient sought hope in herbs, in prayer, in fresh air, or in a glass of wine. And although hope was most often in vain, it gave strength to live another day. Consumption was a special disease also because its course made a person noticeable. The plague took people away too quickly. Leprosy turned them into outcasts. Smallpox left scars. But consumption gave patients an appearance that over time became an almost recognizable symbol. A thin face, pale skin, dark circles under the eyes, and a feverish blush on the cheeks created the image of a person who seemed to be on the verge of death but was still alive. In the Middle Ages, this appearance inspired not only pity but also a special sense of mystery. The sick person seemed to belong to two worlds at once. He was still alive, but his breathing already sounded like a harbinger of the end. Society treated consumptives in different ways. On the one hand, they were pitied and cared for. Unlike lepers, they were not isolated. They were not driven from their homes or buried alive with rituals. Consumptives remained in their families and were lovingly cared for by their relatives. On the other hand, many still feared them. Coughing, blood, weakness, all this suggested contagion, and although the nature of the disease was not clear, people felt that being near a consumptive could make them sick themselves. Therefore, an invisible circle of caution arose around the sick. They were not expelled, but they were not allowed too close. In cultural memory, consumption became established as a quiet and sad disease. Songs and legends mentioned young people who wasted away from long coughs and melancholy. Their death was perceived not as a sudden disaster, but as the slow extinguishing of a candle. The disease even took on a special symbolism. The consumptive became an image of the fragility of human life, but at the same time, an image of spiritual purity. His thin face and quiet voice seemed to be signs that his body no longer belonged to this world. Thus, tuberculosis entered people's consciousness not only as a disease, but also as a special condition. The border between life and death, painful and long. It created an image in culture that was both frightening and compassionate. Consumption was not a sudden outbreak like the plague. It did not descend like an avalanche and disappear after a few years. It flowed through the centuries like a quiet river, always remaining close by. In every village and every town, you could meet people with thin faces and painful coughs. It became part of the normal world. Families knew that someone close to them could fall ill, and they prepared for it in advance, just as they prepared for old age or a long winter. Tuberculosis took lives slowly, but inevitably. It made families poorer because the sick could not work for long periods of time. It forced other family members to care for them for months and years. It was not only a personal tragedy, but also a heavy burden on the community. For society as a whole, consumption was a constant reminder that death was close by. It did not come in the form of an epidemic, but was always part of everyday life. It was not mentioned as loudly as the plague, but everyone knew its signs, and everyone heard its cough. Sometimes it affected entire families. One person fell ill and died years later. Then others fell ill, and so generation after generation lived in its shadow. Tuberculosis was inherited, passing from house to house, from century to century, and so, in the Middle Ages, it was perceived not as a disaster, but as an inevitable companion of life. The plague was a punishment, leprosy was a curse, ergotism was a sign of the devil, and consumption was simply fate, long and difficult. It did not destroy cities, but slowly traced its lines on faces, in families, in generations. Europe lived side by side with it, and that is what made it especially frightening. Thus, tuberculosis became a disease that had no end. It knew no loud catastrophes, but it knew an endless number of quiet deaths, and every cough in the night reminded people that life could fade away, not from loud horror, but from long, agonizing silence. Syphilis, a disease of sin and punishment. While consumption took people slowly and almost imperceptibly, syphilis was a disease with a different face. It did not simply destroy the body, it carried with it the stigma of shame. It was perceived not as an ordinary ailment, but as a special punishment for sins. The history of this disease in the Middle Ages is shrouded in darkness and mystery. It spread through intimacy, which is why it seemed particularly frightening. Whereas the plague or smallpox struck at random, syphilis seemed to choose its victims. Those who succumbed to passion, broke the law, or disobeyed the church. The symptoms were insidious. It all started with a small sore that appeared unnoticed and could disappear on its own. It seemed that the danger had passed, but after weeks and months, the disease returned. Rashes and sores appeared on the skin, slowly eating away at the body. Faces changed, noses and ears became deformed, bones were destroyed. Syphilis turned a person into a shadow of their former self. It did not kill quickly, but it disfigured both the body and the soul. People suffered not only from pain, but also from the fact that their illness was visible to those around them. Every scar, every ulcer spoke of the fact that a person was not only physically ill, but also morally ill. The church saw syphilis as a sign of sin. The disease was associated with promiscuity, broken marriage vows, and secret relationships. Preachers said it was divine punishment for debauchery, and so the sick suffered a double burden, not only physical torment, but also the condemnation of society. Unlike consumption or leprosy, syphilis rarely elicited sympathy. Patients were shunned, despised, and viewed as people who had gotten what they deserved. And that is what made the disease particularly difficult. People found themselves isolated, not only physically, but also spiritually. Thus, syphilis went down in history as the disease of sin. It turned suffering into punishment and made each patient a living reminder that secret desires and hidden passions come at the highest price. After diseases that slowly destroyed the body or left marks of shame and disgrace on it, medieval history knew other disasters. These were diseases that went hand in hand with war, famine, and chaos, where armies gathered, where cities collapsed, where crowds of people huddled in filth and cramped conditions. It always appeared. Typhus. Typhus fever spared no one. It was carried by lice, which multiplied and exhausted troops and refugee camps. When armies crossed borders, they carried with them not only swords and fire, but also an invisible enemy hidden in clothing and hair. The symptoms were rapid and painful. The person first felt weakness and chills, then a high fever. The fever became so severe that the patient lost consciousness, raved, and spoke incoherently. A rash appeared on the body. The skin turned gray, and the eyes sank. With each passing day, the condition worsened, and often within a week, the disease took the person's life. Troops that went on campaign in full force returned empty-handed. The enemy was not always the main killer on the battlefield. More often than not, it was typhus that mowed down soldiers faster than swords and arrows. The chronicles wrote that armies lost thousands of people, not from battles, but from diseases that began after them. Typhus also followed the civilian population. When wars began, people fled the cities, huddling in crowds on the roads, seeking shelter in villages or monasteries. In cramped conditions, amid filth and hunger, the disease spread instantly. Some died on the way. Others brought the infection to new places. Medieval doctors could do almost nothing. They saw that the disease was developing rapidly and could only try to alleviate the suffering. They tried to reduce the fever with cold compresses and gave the sick herbal decoctions to drink, but the outcome was almost always the same: death. Thus, typhus became a true companion of war. It followed armies, pursued refugees, and settled in ruined cities where battles raged and walls collapsed. There was always room for this silent but merciless disease. Dysentery, the killer of armies. Typhus was a formidable companion in wars, but it was not the only disease that mowed down soldiers faster than enemy arrows. Even more terrifying was a disease that seemed much more commonplace and simple: dysentery. It was rarely mentioned in chronicles with the same horror as the plague or leprosy, but for thousands of years it was called the army killer. It began imperceptibly with stomach pain, thirst, and weakness, but this was followed by painful diarrhea, dehydration, and convulsions. A person lost their strength in a matter of days. Soldiers who had been wielding swords yesterday could not get up from the ground a week later. And if death seemed like fate in the case of the plague or smallpox, here it seemed particularly humiliating. From weakness, thirst, and the inability to keep food down. This disease was especially rampant where there was the most dirt and overcrowding. On campaigns, armies lived shoulder to shoulder, ate poorly prepared food, and drank water from rivers and puddles. And every such river could harbor death. Where there was no cleanliness, dysentery always found a place. The chronicles say that armies lost half of their soldiers not from enemy attacks, but from disease. Dysentery mowed down entire camps. Soldiers died by the thousands, and commanders understood that the war was won not by those with more weapons, but by those with fewer diseases. But it wasn't just armies that suffered. In besieged cities, where people lived for weeks without fresh water and food, the disease spread just as quickly. It affected both the rich and the poor, because thirst and filth were the same for everyone. Medieval doctors had almost nothing to offer. They tried to give the sick herbal decoctions, wine, and vinegar to strengthen the stomach, but the disease rarely receded. Most often, the outcome was the same: exhaustion and death. And so, dysentery was feared more than the battles themselves. Soldiers could be brave and strong, but no one could resist thirst and weakness. This disease destroyed armies more quietly than enemies, but more reliably and consistently. Thus, dysentery went down in history as an invisible enemy that did not need swords and arrows. It killed armies, and therefore its name was spoken with particular fear by those who went to war. Childhood diseases: measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, while wars and campaigns decimated armies with typhus and dysentery. Diseases that affected the youngest were the enemy in homes and villages. In the Middle Ages, childhood was rarely a peaceful time. Diseases lurked from the earliest years of life, and many families lost their children before they reached adulthood. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough. These names sound familiar today, but back then they carried a deadly threat. Each of them could turn a home into a place of mourning in a matter of days. Measles began as a simple fever. The child coughed, complained of pain in the eyes, and then a rash appeared. Red spots covered the face and body, and with them came a high temperature. In a small body, the disease flared up quickly and very often ended in death. Parents watched as their child fell asleep in the heat and never woke up again. Scarlet fever seemed even more insidious. Fever, bright red rash, sore throat. The child's body became hot. breathing became difficult, and the tongue took on a strange crimson hue. The disease left little chance of survival. Families prayed, gave herbs, wrapped children in warm fabrics, but more and more often, the outcome was the same. The little body faded away within a few days. Whooping cough was painful in its own way. Children suffocated from long coughing fits. It seemed as if they would never be able to breathe again. The attacks repeated themselves over and over, sometimes dozens of times a day. Many babies died not from the disease itself, but from their lungs being unable to withstand the torture. These diseases were especially frightening because they affected the future of families. Warriors died in battle, women died in childbirth, but nothing caused such despair as the death of children. Parents buried tens of thousands of babies across Europe, and for every home it was a personal tragedy. Doctors and healers tried to treat children's diseases in the same way as adults, with herbs, infusions, and prayers, but more often than not, these efforts were in vain. The disease took its course, and no one could stop it. Thus, the Middle Ages knew yet another shadow, the shadow of diseases that came not to the battlefields or to cities during sieges, but directly to cradles and children's beds. Measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough turned family joy into grief, and every mother knew that her child's future hung in the balance. In the Middle Ages, diseases were not merely physical ailments. Each of them became part of the world in which people lived, part of their ideas about themselves, about God, and about fate. Where the plague wiped out cities, where leprosy turned people into outcasts, where smallpox left scars on faces, new images, new fears, and new rituals were born. Death was always close by, and this determined the very fabric of life. People prayed more often than they ate, because every day reminded them of the fragility of existence. Faith became not only a matter of the soul, but also a means of survival. Prayers, processions, vows, the cult of saints, all this was born out of fear of disease and hope for protection. Culture absorbed these horrors and turned them into symbols, dances of death on frescoes, miniatures depicting lepers, legends of miraculous healings. All this was not decoration, but a living reflection of reality. People saw death every day, and art could not be bright and serene. It became gloomy, reminding people of their mortality and teaching them humility. Society also changed under the pressure of disease. Epidemics leveled the playing field between rich and poor. Everyone was equal in the face of the plague or smallpox, but at the same time, it was disease that exacerbated differences. The poor suffered more often because they lived in cramped and dirty conditions and did not have access to medicine and better food. The rich could leave the city, take refuge in castles, and buy rare medicines. Disease became a mirror of social injustice. Each new outbreak gave rise to new forms of fear. People looked for someone to blame: Jews, witches, strangers. Disease led to violence and pogroms, but at the same time, it also led to the opposite: compassion, the creation of shelters, brotherhoods of mercy, and monasteries where the sick were cared for. Thus, in the Middle Ages, cruelty and mercy, hatred and help coexisted. Diseases also affected the economy. After the Black Death, there were fewer peasants, and their labor became more valuable. People demanded more freedom and more rights. The deaths of millions changed not only the fate of individual families, but also the structure of society. All this together formed a special world, a world where disease was not a temporary disaster, but a constant part of life. Medieval people were born lived and died in the shadow of disease, and therefore their outlook on life was different, less confident, more humble, but also more eager for joy. People sought celebration, laughter, and entertainment because they knew that tomorrow they might not be there. Thus, disease became not only a calamity, but also a driving force of culture. It shaped art, faith, social relations, and even the history of entire countries. Europe emerged from the Middle Ages changed in many ways because it had lived in the shadow of disease for centuries. Diseases in the Middle Ages were no exception. They were part of life itself. Plague, leprosy, smallpox, ergotism, consumption, typhus, dysentery, all of them lived alongside humans, like neighbors from whom it was impossible to escape. Diseases became the backdrop for childhood, marriage, war, and old age. People were born in their shadow and died in their embrace. In the Middle Ages, disease was an everyday reality. It determined destinies, changed cities, broke families, and entire countries. It was a world where any touch, any sip of water, any piece of bread could be the beginning of the end. And if we look back and compare, the contrast seems almost unbelievable. Today, a cold can be cured in a couple of days, but back then, even a simple fever could end in a funeral. Where a pill and rest are enough today, death stood at the bedside in the Middle Ages, and that is why the past seems so distant and frightening, and the present so fragile and precious. We are used to doctors, medicines, hospitals, and the fact that help is always at hand. But for a person in the Middle Ages, this would have been a miracle. So appreciate paracetamol, Wi-Fi, and doctors. And I'm going to bed until someone invents a new plague.